Good afternoon to you. Good to see you. Look, your view on this, and restated for us, is that Australia should be following the Trump administration's move when it comes to where our embassy in Israel is located?
Not exactly. My view is that it is perfectly legitimate for us to consider doing so. In principle, there is absolutely nothing wrong with this move. It's a good move from Morrison, following a very well-developed proposal from Dave Sharma, who is our former ambassador to Israel, knows this area of policy better than anyone else in Australia. I've been appalled at the simplistic and profoundly uninformed nature of the Australian debate. For example, there is in the Australian debate an assumption that Jerusalem is a contested city and therefore to move our embassy to Jerusalem would be to prejudge the outcome. That is simply not true. There is no contest about West Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is a contested territory, and that will be decided in final outcome settlement agreement. Might not happen for 100 years, who knows? But no one, including the Australian government, contests Israeli sovereignty over West Jerusalem. The only argument against having an embassy there has always been an argument about prudence. Will you upset the Palestinians too much? But the idea that there is anything dodgy or illegal or prejudging of final status, we recognise that West Jerusalem is Israeli territory right now.
The current debate, or this week's debate, I suppose, following Malcolm Turnbull's meeting with Joko Widodo, is how Indonesia would react to this, whether that should influence our decision here. When it comes to foreign policy decisions, big or small, Greg, we do have to factor in, how major powers and our regional neighbours feel about things to a degree, don't we?
Well, David, almost as unsophisticated about the debate as the debate about Jerusalem was, it was even less sophisticated, the debate about Jakarta. Now, I have covered at least 1,000 ups and downs in the Australia-Indonesia relationship. Every time the Indonesian Foreign Ministry bats an eye, it's not necessary for us to have a nervous breakdown. Indonesia does lots of things we don't like. It canes homosexuals for sitting too close to each other. It executes our tourists who are on minor drug offences. But nonetheless, we still have a good relationship with them. The idea, plainly sources very, very sympathetic to Malcolm Turnbull have been putting out this preposterous notion that the Indonesians are so upset about the change of Prime Minister that they were going to walk away from the trade deal. And now that they're so upset about us having a discussion about Jerusalem that they're going to stop counter-terrorism cooperation, stop people smuggling cooperation. Those ideas are ridiculous. They are absolutely ridiculous, and they betray on the part of the people who put them a complete unfamiliarity with the way Jakarta works. Of course, there's a bit of pantomime in all this. The Indonesians will say they don't like this or they don't like that. But the Indonesian system is almost uniquely set up for nothing ever to happen. And, they put up with Tony Abbott turning the boats back and we lost not one zot of cooperation. The idea that the whole of the relationship is on the line over this is ridiculous. And, of course, if it were on the line, then it would be a relationship not worth having because they'd be assuming veto power over our policy towards Israel. I think Malcolm Turnbull's words were grossly destructive and irresponsible. He was Scott Morrison's envoy in Jakarta and he came out and publicly trashed Scott Morrison's policy. Now, that's one of the most disloyal and grossly irresponsible things, and nothing is more likely to encourage the Indonesians in the belief that they have a veto over our policy than that kind of hysterical overreaction, which has been, echoed by many Australian commentators this week.
Well, he certainly did more than just, point out the Indonesian view. He reminded everyone that his position not to shift the embassy was based on, very careful consideration of all these in consultation with all of our defence and intelligence agencies and so on. End of the day, Greg, Indonesia may not stop cooperating with Australia, may not, scrap a free trade agreement and so on. But, it's clear it would rather we didn't do this, and plenty of other countries as well. Do you think at the end of the day Australia should do this, that it would be in our interests to shift that embassy?
I think it's an open question, David. You see, again, the sterility and simplicity and childishness of our debate is so depressing. A country implements a foreign policy which reflects its interests and its values. And it is not surprising that the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade will always be imprisoned in the current paradigm, will always be incrementalist, will always be risk adverse, and will always put process over values. But it is absolutely right for a government. The Foreign Affairs Department works for the government, not the other way around. Now, it is not in our interests to have an international system in which the world is paralysed in its relations with Israel because of popular Muslim sentiment in any country. The simple truth, of course, is that Indonesia has absolutely zero influence in the Middle East. No one in the Middle East takes the slightest bit of notice of anything Indonesia says or does. But it is in our interest for small countries, culturally isolated in their environment, not to be abandoned by their friends. And what are we really saying? That we support Israel as a liberal democracy. By our actions, we thoroughly recognise Israeli sovereignty over West Jerusalem. We're always visiting the Knesset, always interacting with the ministries in West Jerusalem and so on. There are no advisories to our politicians or our officials not to interact officially in West Jerusalem. But alone amongst all the nations of the world, Israel has no right to decide where its own capital is, so that someone else should be able to tell Australia its capital should not be in Canberra, but it should be in Sydney. Now, at the end of the day, we might still decide that the move is more trouble than it's worth, but it is a sign of decency and maturity in the Australian government that they are willing to have this discussion based on values, and it is a dismal sign of how unsophisticated our foreign policy debate is that we just had a blather through the last 2 weeks of empty cliches, utterly uninformed by the knowledge of international law, how many nations do recognise Jerusalem as the capital of Israel already, what Jakarta's form is on this sort of stuff. It's been a very dispiriting response to a very creative and interesting proposal from the government.
Greg Sheridan, foreign editor of The Australian. Always good to hear from you. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll catch up next week. Appreciate it.
Thanks, David.
We're going to take a quick break and back with the last